A group of people were observing at the back of the resort. They actually turned around and said that a UFO flew over them at low level and then flew over them and flew off into the distance towards the mountains. And then 10 or 15 minutes later, it came back. Whatever this machine was, it manifested, and their anticipation of it brought it into this reality. We do not know what consciousness is. We do not know where consciousness comes from. We have no idea, even first base, of how consciousness creates or how consciousness is created by the brain. Is it just an epiphenomenon? In terms of my years of reading around the subject, both from esoterica to science, consciousness, I argue, is a field. There's a field of consciousness. I think it's probably something to do with the holographic nature of the universe and the holographic argument.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. If there's one thing that I've learned over the years, and maybe this is cliche, but it's the more that we learn, the more we realize we don't know. Every breakthrough leads to new questions. Every insight leads to more mysteries. And maybe this is where that whole trope of the esoteric potentially driving you bonkers comes from. But it's not just the esoteric. This seems to be true regardless of what type of wisdom you're pursuing. It definitely seems to be true in the case of science and mathematics, spirituality too, of course. I can confidently say that it's true when it comes to the fare we've been covering on the channel as of late. You know, the NHI, UFO, UAP phenomena, and consciousness. The mystery never really ends. And I should be clear on this too. I'm just talking about those topics respectively, not even the link between consciousness and the UAP phenomena, which I shall resist the urge to do with every fiber of my being, at least for now. As endless as the mystery may be, I do think we can up the resolution on it. We can begin to see it more clearly if we use all of the multidisciplinary sense-making lenses and philosophical lenses at our disposal. And Anthony Peake is really an exemplar of that method. He's the author of a dozen books on numerous topics, you know, consciousness, non-human intelligence, near-death experiences, altered states. I just read his book on the personal Daemon, which was really intriguing. So not only do I respect his approach, this man is a true seeker, truly brilliant. He's kind of the perfect guest for this show in a lot of ways, and you're about to see why. I can say with high confidence that he will be back in future episodes. I can also say with a fairly high degree of confidence that if you make it to Contact in the Desert this year, you may have a chance to see both Anthony and myself, as we're both planning to attend. Anyway, all the links that you will need for Anthony Peake and the show are in the description. Please do me a favor, like, subscribe, comment, share. The algorithm must be fed. We've got hundreds of audio-only podcasts that will never be up on YouTube with really brilliant beings, so do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts. And come initiate yourself into our digital Wonder Lodge at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. Yes, it is a fantastic way to support the show, but you also get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. We have a patron-only Discord server. We do Zoom hangs. We also just did a book club earlier today on the really fantastic book by Annie Jacobson, Phenomena. Would love to see you there, my friends. But for now, let's meld minds with Anthony Peake. So much to talk about. Everything I wrote down from your book, I feel like is just one of the central interests that I often innately find myself in on this show. So I'm really excited to explore it all with you.
Absolutely. And I've been checking out your previous shows and everything else as well. And yeah, we're kindred spirits. We both seem to, the same things seem to stimulate us, which is really interesting. So I think this conversation could go absolutely anywhere. And that's exactly what we allow it to do.
Me too. Yeah. And on that note, it's always like an embarrassment of riches on where to start in that regard. But I guess I'm just going to ask you something that's sort of in the zeitgeist as of late that I find myself continuously being drawn into is everything going around right now about non-human intelligence, disclosure. How closely do you follow that?
Oh, totally. I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware, but I'm a regular speaker at Contact in the Desert in Southern California.
I just got invited to that, actually. Are you going this year? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm speaking this year. Yeah, I'll be
Oh,
there this
cool,
year.
cool. Well, I may
Yeah.
see you. I may see you.
Oh, absolutely, we will. Absolutely. Because funnily enough, I was at Contact in the Desert 2 years ago when the news on disclosure broke, and I was having lunch with Linda Moulton Howe when it
Oh,
took
wow.
place, and Richard Dolan was also in our little group. So they all got excited and all rushed off, and it was quite amazing to be in that group when that happened. But
Yeah.
Contact in the Desert is extraordinary, and of course, my book, The Hidden Universe. Effectively, I have a concept I called egregorials, which
Mm,
is aliens, which is
yeah.
effectively aliens. In fact, when I first started my whole exercise of becoming a writer, I mean, it was UFOs that was my first entree into the world of esoterica and unusual phenomenon. So no, it's very much my area of interest.
Perfect, beautiful. I had no idea, to be honest. Like, I was a little bit reluctant to even ask that question because I was like, I just said, I just finished the Daemon book. That is a subject that I'm hugely interested in, and I thought that this would get us to that topic in a way that would be interesting for the audience. But it sounds like you have a whole separate and deep interest in that subject. So yes, this concept of egregores. This is something that you find in modern Western esotericism. I'm not sure who coined that term. Who
The background to the word egregore is really quite fascinating in that it is from the Greek egregorius, which you will find in the Gnostic Gospels, and it effectively is the concept of the watchers, because
Mm,
egregore literally means watchers. And now I
okay.
remember when I was a kid, when I first came across the concept of watchers, I'm much older than you, and I remember in the mid 1960s being fascinated. I think it was the Fantastic Four, the Marvel comic.
Hmm.
Were the Fantastic Four Marvel? I think they were. They might have been DC. I
Yep,
can't
yep.
remember. They
They
were
are.
Marvel.
Yep.
And one of the characters, one of the reoccurring characters in the Fantastic Four was the Watcher, who reoccurred in many, many times, but he hasn't actually appeared, I don't think, in the Marvel movie world, which I think is quite sad because it's a very interesting concept.
Yeah.
And also there was a fascinating song. Again, I go off on tangents here, but
Feel
on
free.
the album Nursery Crime by the band Genesis, way back in 1972, I think it was released, they have a track there called Watcher of the Skies. And it's a really intriguing song because it takes a lot of the ideas of the Watcher from the Fantastic Four, but also brings in the esoteric elements as well. So the word Watcher, egregorus, and the concept of the egregore is something I explore in my book, The Hidden Universe, because I argue that we can co-create entities. By our anticipation of them, we can manifest them. And of course, we know from esoteric tradition, in my book, I review the work of going right back in history, the concept of egregores, right through to the work of people like who was the esoteric, well, I suppose
Crowley or
Crowley to a later degree,
Agrippa.
and of course Agrippa and John Dee, for
Yeah.
example.
Okay. Yeah.
And of course John Dee was trying to create egregores, and of course the word egregore and watcher is really associated with the Book of Enoch
Okay.
in the New Testament. Is it the Old Testament? New Testament? I never remember that either. But the Book of Enoch is the idea, because Enoch, if you read the Book of Enoch, it's really quite strange.
Yeah.
And they have these entities that appear in the Book of Enoch. And this is what John Dee and esotericists were trying to do for years, was to bring these beings through from somewhere else, then use them to control them in one way or another. So it was a kind of a role of trying to control these thought forms. But of course, if we go back over into modern times, we have an awful lot of ideas about egregores, because
Mhm.
sociologically, an egregore is something like Coca-Cola. It's like a brand. It's something that
Right.
we all recognize subliminally as being something external to ourselves that has reality, like socialism and communism. They're all egregores in one way or another.
Yeah.
But the idea is, I argue, that we can create these. Now, there's a lady called Alexander Neal, who was a Belgian French explorer in the 1920s, and she went to Tibet to travel. And while they were there, her and her little group of Buddhist friends, they created a thought form. They created what's called a tulpa.
Yes.
And I don't know if you know in the story, because it's intriguing, because they create this friendly, rotund little monk. And initially he does their bidding and he's really friendly, and then suddenly he turns malevolent, and they have to ostracize him. They have to destroy him because he's become independent of them. And I've argued long, and indeed in my talks last year in Contact in the Desert, I argued that the entities that people experience during abductions and everything else, they're the same entities. They are part of us. Using the example, for instance, of the Islamic concept of the jinn. In the Quran it said that I think man was made of earth, the angels were made of light, and the jinn were made of smokeless fire. Now, I was always intrigued by what do they mean by smokeless fire, and then you think about it and you think, do you know what smokeless fire? It's plasma.
Okay.
So, and again, it's unfortunate actually, because a future guest on your show would have been an interesting guy called Paul Eno. Paul sadly died last year. He's an ex-Catholic priest who used to travel around the New England countryside doing ghost hunting, and I've just got this vision of all these black cassocked priests running around chasing ghosts. And he wrote a wonderful book called Dancing Past the Graveyard, I think it was. And in this book, he tells a series of stories of events he investigated when he was doing his investigation work. And he came to the conclusion that egregores are a form of plasma, and they need sort of electromagnetic energy to kind of manifest. You'll find them around electric substations and things like this, as if this is where they're drawing in the energy. So very, very intriguing, but I think there's a link between them all, and maybe we can expand on this a little bit later if you're interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So just to underscore this concept of egregores. So this is an idea that you'll find largely in the Western esoteric tradition, and usually it's defined as something like a mind or collective intelligence or being that manifests over the top of a community. Like you said, it could be a brand, it could be a group. Like we joke around in my Discord sometimes that there would be an egregore for this community, and like the whole
like we're creating an egregore now.
Right. Yeah, sure. Like a tertiary spirit, or like a daemon for the for whatever the organization or group is. There's an interesting idea from so I've been really down the rabbit hole of the Monroe Institute lately.
Oh, right. Yes. I've written about Robert Monroe.
Oh, cool. So I did a Gateway retreat recently. I've been reading the whole Gateway report on the channel. I did a sort of story that goes through the background of all the psychic spy programs, as well as my experience there. And there's a very, as you know, if you've read Monroe's books, there's a very similar idea in Monroe's books that even, I mean, this extends all the way to like life after death, that essentially like the world's popular religions create these non-physical, like mental manifestations of expectation that people will get pulled into after death. So this is an idea that seems to be, I think it has one of the great litmus tests, I think, for these esoteric ideas is how many different lenses do they work under? And it seems like, as we're alluding to, and we'll get to shortly, it seems like this ties into the UFO phenomenon. It seems like this may tie into near-death experiences. It seems clearly it's very prominent in Western esotericism. So whenever very equivalent ideas are popping up in multiple different sort of schools of thought independently, I pay a lot of attention.
Well, it's funny enough, my latest book is on near-death experiences.
Great.
Because the other great thread in my writing right the way through is the near-death experience. And in my latest book, I discuss exactly this. I mix in the elements of the egregorial together with something I call the Huxleyan spectrum, which is what I call the scale of transcendence, which is an idea that certain individuals, their doors of perception are more open. And I wrote a book on this a few years ago called Opening the Doors of Perception. And the idea that, depending upon our neurological correlates, is whether we can dampen down the brain's ability to act as an attenuator, to actually take out information within the greater information field.
Yeah.
And I argue that, when people experience near-death experiences, for example, there does seem to be, I do the anthropology of it. I'm really fascinated by the anthropological aspects as well. And I came across a couple of fascinating cases, which I cite in the book, which may be of interest to you, whereby, and I'll be citing this in Contact in the Desert, is that I came across a number of cases of near-death experiences that took place in the 1960s in New Guinea. And if you look at these near-death experiences, they're alien abductions. Not only are they alien abductions, but there are so many parallels. And I think I'm genuine in saying, I think I'm the only writer that's made this link in this way, is that 2 or 3 of the cases, for instance, there's one case where a guy has a near-death experience, finds himself somewhere else, and he finds a house in the middle of the jungle. And the house is on stilts. And he feels himself being drawn up into the house. And then he realizes that the house is not actually on stilts, it's hovering and it's going round. Now, that's a classic UFO case. And indeed, when I was at Contact in the Desert last year, I had the opportunity to discuss this with Whitley Strieber and also with Travis Walton. Because if you look at Travis Walton's case, he's actually sucked up into the UFO. And this is exactly what this person described in New Guinea. Now, we can draw parallels here with the New Guinea cargo cults. Because, in the cargo cults, they believed that during the Second World War, when the Americans arrived, that all these goods came out the sky and the planes arrived. And they realized that by doing certain rituals, you could get these benefits coming down. So clearly, within the near-death experience, within that community, not only are there UFO encounters, but there are also elements of the near-death experience that can parallel directly the cargo cult's idea. Because when they have near-death experiences, they go to this place where things are being manufactured. They go into places where things are being built, which is exactly what you'd expect that a near-death experience from somebody from a cargo cult would believe them to be. So I argue that the near-death experience is completely created by our expectations of it. And it's facilitated by dimethyltryptamine or endogenous dimethyltryptamine is my argument as well, which we can come on to. But what's more interesting is that that doesn't mean they're not real. This is the question, and my central question in all my books is, what is reality? What is real? Because we make this assumption that there's a solidity in the external world out there, that it exists when we're not looking at it, that we are just observers of an external reality. But of course, anybody that's studied consciousness studies or has studied the brain and neurology and how the brain inwardly constructs an image of the external world, for instance, you're probably aware of the fact that neurologists and consciousness studies people, when somebody turns around and believes there's a one-to-one relationship between what I experience inside my head in terms of the visual field and what is out there, they're called naive realists.
I was just going to say that. It's called naive realism.
It's naive realism.
Yeah.
Great, that's good. So we're really attuned here.
Yeah.
So you know the concept then of naive realism, and it's the idea that there is nothing out there. Effectively, we think everything is solid. Solidity is an illusion. Solidity is only there. You only feel something because of electrostatic repulsion, which is effectively the as you probably know, within each atom, the outer ring of each atom has an electron, and the electron is negatively charged, which means the atoms and the electrons in your backside or in your fingers is similarly negatively charged. So when you feel you are touching something, the sensations you are receiving is actually the electrostatic repulsion. You never touch anything. But indeed, what you think is solid matter is actually 99.99999999996 empty space within the nucleus. Within the atom itself, and I'm using here the hydrogen atom as an example, but effectively that's the level of empty space. And of course, you have the nucleus in the middle, which is made up of the neutron and the proton. But effectively, they themselves are point particles and are made up themselves of quarks. And, they're just configurations of different types of quarks that create. So you have an up quark and a down quark and whatever, and they make a positron, for example. But the point of the matter is that the quarks themselves are point particles. So they have no extension in space. So they're not physically existing in the way we understand it. Similarly with the electrons. So effectively the atoms which come together to make molecules, which come together to make compounds and everything else, that makes the world around us is mostly empty space. 96% of the universe is missing. We know that from the calculations that have been done because of the way in which galaxies revolve. There's more matter around a galaxy than we can see, and it's called dark matter. And within dark matter, there's dark energy. Again, they are things we do not know, nor do we understand. So then we come down to the point of, well, what is actually processing the qualia, the stimuli, the sensory stimuli that's coming in? What is processing inside my head? What is processing and changing effectively electrochemical signals that are stimulated by my retina? When a photon hits my retina, it's converted into an electrochemical signal, which is then processed in the darkest part of my brain, the visual cortex, the back here, and it's reconstituted, from a literally postage stamp image that is inverted, is changed into this sense-around, visionary, colourful field that I consider to be the visual world. So even there's something magical taking place. But then we go back one step further, and then we think, well, hold on a minute. What's doing the perceiving? So there is a kind of, people work on this idea of the homunculus, the idea that inside your head is a little version of you in a little room, and there's big speakers that are attached to your ears, and there's big TV screens that are attached to the outside world. But of course, that suggests an infinite regress, because it would argue that the homunculus itself will have a little person in its head.
Yeah.
That doesn't work. So we have to come to something more conclusive about this. And the question is, we don't know. And this is the thing I delight in engaging with scientists, which I do all the time, because the way they find dealing with me difficult is that I'm interested in these subjects, but I dig far deeper than they expect somebody to dig. They don't expect somebody to throw at them qualia. They don't expect somebody to throw at them David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah.
They don't expect that. They expect you to be some kind of woo-woo nut job who just believes in, I don't know, vibrations and everything like that. And when you get talking to them, you realize that they feel the same way. As they say with quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is as damn near magic as you can imagine anything being.
Totally. Pardon the interruption, my friends. Obviously, we throw a lot of esoteric ideas around on the channel. And to be sure, the history of Western esotericism can be a twisty, turny, labyrinthian rabbit hole. There's so much mystery, so much we'll never know. But one thing I do know is that if you want to look to some of the most foundational and influential works in Western esotericism, you cannot look past the Platonic tradition and the Hermetic tradition. And that's why I am so excited about what Gallo Glass Books is doing. They've got two incredible, very limited offerings that are absolute jewels for any esoteric nerd's bookshelf. They've got Monad, which is a collection of writings by Neoplatonic sages Plotinus, Porphyry, and Proclus, which, by the way, I'm told there are only about 100 or so remaining copies of, so move on that one quickly. And I cannot wait to secure a copy of their latest offering, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, which you can pre-order now at a special price, which I do recommend doing because, again, this is an extremely limited piece. There will only ever be 2,500 copies made. And I want to emphasize, these are not just reissues of classics, my friends. The whole aesthetic is absolutely on point. The quality is super high. You can tell they're giving the utmost respect to these works. They really want to do something special. Grab them before they're gone, and do be sure to use the link in the description to let them know that your friend Michael P. sent you. Much love, and back to the episode. Yeah, as soon as non-locality becomes a core part of the entire theory in and of itself, suddenly you have to throw a lot of your assumptions about reality, especially naive realism style reality, completely out the window and start asking new questions. So much so that, as I'm sure you know, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, they write that famous paper talking about, come on, like look at this. If quantum physics is real, we got to assume all of this is not real. So clearly it can't be real. And now, as anybody who remotely follows this knows, Nobel Prizes have been awarded. I think it was in 2022 to 3 different scientists, essentially stamping quantum theory with as real, as replicable, as demonstrated of science as there can be. And quantum non-locality is a core feature of that reality. And, this is the example with, entanglement. I won't get into all of it because I want to go back to the initial question.
But very quickly, just jumping in there.
Yeah.
The whole thing of entanglement, as you rightly say, when Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen came up with their 1937 thought experiment, Einstein was trying to prove, in effect, as he said to Niels Bohr, when he turned around, he said, "I do not believe that the moon is not there when I'm not looking at it." So they come up with this thought experiment, which was to counter, and it was rather like Schrödinger with Schrödinger's cat trying to disprove it. People think Schrödinger was trying to prove it, but he was doing the opposite. And of course, what happens then, John Bell in 1964 comes up with Bell's inequality, the CERN scientist. And then in 1980, 81, Alain Aspect and Dalibard and Roger at the Paris Institute of Optics did it experimentally, proving that if you put two subatomic particles into the same quantum state, and you put them in different places, they could be thousands of miles apart. You do one to the other, they instantaneously communicate, which means at a lower level of reality, everything is a unity.
Right.
Doesn't it?
Right. Yeah, it certainly implies that. So back to the, so we definitely implied the relationship between this idea of consciousness, egregores, and the UAP UFO phenomenon, but we never really fully connected the dots there. So again, just to refresh the audience's memory, because we've taken a nice fun digression here, is so I asked you about non-human intelligence, your thoughts on this phenomena, how much you follow it, and you liken the phenomena to egregores. And that, so again, to if in case that term is still foggy, that there are these manifestations of consciousness that can either mentally or non-physically form, or perhaps even physically form. And I'm going to jump to the conclusion that you're implying that that is what UAPs are. These orbs of light often that appear, or what seem to be craft that appear, may at least partially be constituted of the consciousness of the experiencer or the group.
Very much so. In fact, there was an incident that took place at Contact in the Desert last year, which I thought was very intriguing, whereby a group of people were observing at the back of the resort that the event takes place in Indian Wells. And they came back and they actually turned around and said that a UFO flew over them at low level, and then flew over them and flew off into the distance towards the mountains. And then 10 or 15 minutes later, it came back. Now, to me, that was extraordinary because it was a collective hallucination, for want of a better terms. And of course, we know that the whole idea of collective hallucinations is a scientific explanation for group hallucinations, but there's no explanation as to how people subliminally and consciously see the same thing unless there's telepathy. Right. So I've always argued, that the scientists are using one thing they don't like to explain something they don't like even more. Right. So there's the argument, there's these nebulous terms like folie à deux. If two people share something, it's a folie à deux. It's just a technical term. I called it the labeling explanatory theory. The idea, give it a nice label, give it a nice Latin phrase or a Greek phrase, and people will think you understand. Effectively, it's I call it idiomatic science. Idiopathic science, I should say, because the word idiopathy in technical terms means we haven't got a clue. If you've got idiopathic epilepsy, it means that we don't know what's causing it. But what was fascinating about this was I came to the conclusion that the group's anticipation was so strong, whatever this machine was, it manifested, and their anticipation of it brought it into this reality. Now, one of the things that was fascinatingly curious was that a few months afterwards, I was doing a talk at Southend-on-Sea, which is in Essex, it's in the southeast of England. And I was doing a talk, and I did my talk. And then afterwards, this lady came over to me, and she had a film on her phone, on her iPhone. And she said, I want you to explain this because I find it quite intriguing. So she showed it me. And on the film, she's looking out of a window overlooking the English Channel, overlooking the Thames estuary from her flat in Southend. And there's somebody next to her. And she's going, look at that. She said, look, I'm filming. Can you see that? And you see a line of white UFOs, white lights, almost like Skylink, but it's not. But it looked like that, going across literally the other side of the river. And one of the lights goes to the forward, and then the other one flicks to the forward, and then the one at the back comes forward. And she's filming this. And she said, it's absolutely extraordinary. And she says, I wonder if it's a mark on the window. So she opens the window, and it's still there, which was intriguing. But what was even more intriguing was when she finishes the filming and starts the camera, she speaks to her friend, and her friend couldn't see anything. And her friend said, I can't see. And as this lady said to me, she said, how can that be? The phenomenon I was witnessing through my eyes, through the lens of the phone, was in three-dimensional reality in my world. But in my friend who was standing right next to me, it didn't exist, even though it registered on the filming device in the phone.
Yeah.
Now that is incredible. So that means we can not only can we manifest an anticipation of an external object, but that external object can actually do something on a charge coupling device inside a phone, in a video film, and create it. Which means effectively coming back to the idea that we draw from somewhere this energy form, which is brain created. Because of course, you're clearly very knowledgeable on the phenomenon. You'll know about the Philip experiment from 1970.
I don't think I do, actually.
Okay, so the Toronto experiment, it took place in 1970-71. And there were a group of spouses of academics at the University of Toronto. And they got interested, as a lot of people do, they got interested in Ouija. And they were doing Ouija games and everything else. And being scientists and being psychologists, they wanted to know what was actually causing the motive force that was moving the glass round. And they were saying, is it our anticipation? Are we subliminally moving it, subconsciously moving it? So they decided to do a very interesting test. And what they did was they got one of the group to go away and make up a total fictional character called Philip Aylesford. And this lady, being a historian, she created a fictional story about a lord called Philip Aylesford who lived in the 1670s or 1680s in Warwickshire after the English Civil War. She said in her storyline that this guy was a Catholic, therefore, in the period after the Civil War, he was an outsider. He was also in a loveless marriage. And one day he meets a gypsy woman. He falls in love. His wife finds out, leaves him, and he commits suicide by jumping off the battlements of the castle. Total fiction. But they then decided to see if they could communicate with Philip Aylesford using Ouija. And lo and behold, they could. And not only that, but Philip started to communicate information that wasn't part of the story, but added to the story. But then things started to get strange because they started to have, the table started to turn and it started to move and vibrate and jump up and down. And they created poltergeist activity. And they actually asked Philip, are you creating this? And Philip said, yes, he was. So there is then a wonderful caveat to this because they did a live TV performance on Canadian television in 1970 or 71, which you can find on YouTube. And when they're doing it, the table starts to rock. The physical manifestations took place live in a studio. Now, to me, this parallels in many ways. Have you come across the skull experiment at all?
I'm not sure.
Okay. The skull experiment was an experiment that took place in the early 1990s, I think, in a small village called Skull in Norfolk in the UK, in East Anglia.
Okay.
And again, what was happening was they were communicating with entities.
Sorry to interrupt. Is this town famous for spiritualism and psychics? Because there's some town in the Northeast, I'm forgetting what it's called, but apparently it's like a whole bunch of mediums live there, and it's like a town of weird phenomena that's constantly going on, but I don't know if it's the same place or not.
I don't think it was Skull. I don't think it was, but it doesn't mean it wasn't. Okay. But Skull in Norfolk is not the northeast as such anyway, so it's it's still the south of England, sort of. But
you're talking about England. I was thinking the U.S. Sorry.
Oh right. Right. Yes.
There's a Norfolk, Virginia too. Yeah.
Ah right. Okay. I can see now. No, it's Norfolk in England. And they started to communicate. They get communications from these beings who are claiming they're trying to communicate from wherever they are. Now, there was a fascinating book called The Skull Experiment, which was written about it. Now, I've interviewed and met up with a number of people who witnessed the phenomenon taking place. They had poltergeist activity, they had apports appearing, newspapers from the Second World War appeared. But one of the weirdest things was one day they had an apparition appear on the TV screen of in the house.
Wow.
And they called the being Blue. Now, if you look at Blue, it's a grey. It's definitely a grey. So there we have this machine. You know, if you'd taken Whitley Strieber's cover to Communion, it's that. So clearly, whatever these beings were, they were either aware of our anticipations, sort of, because these people were spiritualists. They were not UFO buffs. They were spiritualists. Right. But they were manifesting entities that clearly were alien and were clearly trying to manipulate them in one way or another. And this parallels, I wrote a book a few years ago with Professor Irvin Laszlo. And in this, we discussed about evidence of life after death. And I came across a series of fascinating experiments that took place in the 1890s by the Society for Cyclical Research. And it was called Imperator and Rector. And again, these group of people were communicating with entities from somewhere else. And I argue this is, again, egregore creation. You know, they're creating the egregores, and the egregores are coming through. And this is why the UFO phenomenon culturally tracks us. This is why the UFOs in the 1890s and the flaps of the airships, they were German. Right. And they were in airships. And then they come forward, and then we had the Space Brothers in the 1950s, you know, the Festinger book, you know, when prophecy fails and everything else. Which, as an aside, by the way, I also wrote a biography of Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer. And he knew the people that were involved in this experiment in California. So there was some very interesting manifestations that took place there. So then you move forward, you get into the 1970s, and then you get the Greys.
Yeah.
And it's clear from what is taking place is they know what we want to expect, and they fulfill it. Yes. And of course, that's a classic egregorial thing, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And this idea, so this is something you mentioned Kripal, and this is one of the things that sort of haunted me in not necessarily a malevolent way, but one of the things I bring up in many conversations and is right at the tip of my mind, which is, you know, Kripal himself has studied all manner of phenomena for decades, right? Mm. And he is a believer in a way and skeptical in another way. And he is a believer in the phenomenon of all of these things we're talking about, near-death experiences, the UAP phenomenon, spiritualist type phenomenon. But he doubts the image and the way it presents to the experiencer. So the implied question then is, what is the intelligence that is choosing the depiction? Is it cultural? Is it something in the collective unconscious or zeitgeist in sort of Jungian terms? Is it the individual? Is it the, you know, all these interesting questions? And then immediately, again, you're breaking the naive realist framework, because it implies that there's some kind of hierarchy of intelligence or psyche that we are tapped into, and that is active, yet is also contingent upon our experiencing of it. And, you know, that really brings, and I wanted to bring this up too. The Neoplatonist Iamblichus, who is, you know, unfortunately way too niche, because he, I think, is the terminus for a lot of what today we would know as the Western esoteric tradition, because, you know, he is the first Neoplatonist who is really privileging ritual and theurgy and what sounds very much like, you know, Western esoteric ritual magic. I mean, he's privileging this as the most important thing, even, you know, very central to his own philosophy is working with divinity, or working with whatever you want to call it. So, and what he says is that that the experience of the divine presenting itself, or daimones presenting themselves to the practitioner of theurgy, it's sort of a it's relational, and the way that they present is unique to the individual. But there are still certain like hallmarks that he gives in his most famous work on the mysteries. But this idea is very old, is my point, is that there is some kind of relationship between the experiencer or summoner and then the way that thing appears. But the question I have for you is then, in your mind, are all of these phenomena completely generated by human consciousness? Or is it a relationship between an unseen phenomena that has to manifest itself some way, and it has its own real ontos? It's just that the way that it presents is going to be unique every time.
I think the we need to take a step back in terms of this when we're using the word consciousness. And as I hinted earlier on when I was talking about David Chalmers and his hard problem, is that we do not know what consciousness is. We do not know where consciousness comes from. We have no idea, even first base, of how consciousness creates, or how consciousness is created by the brain. Is it just an epiphenomenon of brain behaviors? Does it just spontaneously appear? You know, as I've argued in one of my books, is it just the addition of one molecule, one quark, and then suddenly consciousness downloads? Or is it more interesting? And I'm not unique in this, and I'm not even claiming that I am. But consciousness, I argue, is a field. There's a field of consciousness. I think it's probably something to do with the holographic nature of the universe and the holographic argument and the holographic nature. So it's the idea that consciousness, for me, in terms of how my years of reading around the subject, both from esoterica to science, is that there are levels of consciousness and levels of awareness. And that effectively, and you will not be aware of this from reading the book, The Daemon, but in my latest book, the second to last book, Cheating the Ferryman, I come up with this idea that there is everything is consciousness is prime. Consciousness is the backdrop of everything. Now, your reference there to the pre-Socratics and the Platonists is very, very interesting, because I've long been interested in the concept of the Jungian zeitgeist, the idea of archetypes, the idea, as you say, you've got a picture in your background there of Philoman, which was Jung's Daemon, and the idea that we are reduced down consciousness from a greater consciousness field. Now, what I argue in my overall hypothesis, which I call Cheating the Ferryman, is that we are individuated egos existing within a simulation. Each ego has above it its spirit guide, its amnesis, its daemon. I call it the daemon, but you can call it your spirit guide or whatever you want, which exists outside of this time frame. It exists outside of linear time, could exist in orthogonal time, as Philip K. Dick called it, the idea that there's a time behind time. And I'd argue, for instance, if anybody's seen the movie Interstellar, in the Tesseract sequence in Interstellar, the Christopher Nolan movie, you have this situation whereby the main character is looking into the life of his daughter, into what they call the Tesseract, which is this it's 4 dimensions. It's seeing a square from 4 dimensions. And he sees all the elements of her life taking place in one moment. Now, from the viewpoint of the daemon, that is what is taking place. The daemon has lived your life this time and many times before. Using a modern analogy, he's your the daemon is your game player. You know, you're existing in a 3-dimensional virtual reality version of your life, which inside the program, inside the holographic program, is the outcome of every decision you can possibly ever make, and every decision that any other human being can make. And the daemon plays the game for you, guides you through, if the doors of perception are open enough. It's getting a bit complex now, but I'm hoping we can add more material to this.
For sure.
Just because to answer your question, to move on. So then I argue that above the daemon is something I call the uber daemon. And the uber daemon is my equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious. But because, unlike Jung, I do the science of this, I do the neurology, I do the neurochemistry of how this is manifested, how it's manifested physiologically. how it's manifested using quantum mechanics, how it's manifested using applications of Hammerhoff and Penrose's orchestrated objective reduction argument, and the way in which the microtubules in the brain are receivers of information, and they reduce and they effectively collapse the wave function of that anticipatory universe, which exists in potential, but the point of observation by a sentience, it turns it into a point particle in a point location, which then embroiders a whole new reality. But we'll go back to that later. And then I argue that above, and each one of these levels, so the eidolon is a single conscious, these are all terms from Platonic's thought and the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries. So it's all from that. The Daemon, the eidolon, they're all terms that Socrates used, that Plato used. And of course, the concept of anamnesis and everything else, it's all central to this. And indeed, I'm planning, and I'm still thinking of doing this, we're planning to recreate Plato's cave in Greece. I did some research, and I found from a paper written in 1905, the location of where Plato's cave is. Yeah, it's the Cave of Vari. And it's along the coast around about 20 miles east of Athens. Wow. And one of my books is out in Greek, and my Greek publisher is very interested in working with me on this. But that's another aside, because that's a whole new interesting area I'm going into.
Another quick aside, my most popular thing that I've ever published is a piece I did on Plato's cave and the sort of deeper hidden esoteric layers of that allegory, and how it sort of mushrooms out in a fractal way where it can take on, I was talking about these ideas that transcend lenses, and the Plato's cave allegory is one of my favorite examples of that.
Funnily enough, with your Mandelbrot set behind you, clearly, it's something that fascinates you. Well, funnily enough, again, as an aside, myself and a group of friends, we recreated Plato's cave in an experiment which we did 6 years ago, almost now 6 years ago, in a group of caves or tunnels in the Midlands in the UK, where we literally recreated Plato's cave. And I was the Hierophant. I was actually wearing purple robes and everything.
Oh, wow.
And I spoke to we had a group of volunteers who were there, who didn't know what was going to happen. And I turned up speaking to them in Greek. And we literally recreated Plato's cave in the darkest part of these heavily, heavily haunted tunnels. A really weird event. And we had a group of friends of mine, Dr. Winkler and Dr. Prokal. Winkler and Prokal, one is a consultant neurologist and the other guy's a consultant psychologist. And indeed, they were with me at Contact in the Desert 2 years ago. And they've invented something called the lucid light device, which actually can create out-of-body experiences, sort of like out-of-body experiences and altered states of consciousness. So we put people into a light trance. We had hypnotists there. We had psychologists, research psychologists, and we put people into a light trance. Wow. And then we took them into the caves. And it was extraordinary. There's I'm hoping that one day the video will be released, because there was a film crew came over from Denmark for it. And our intention now is that we will take that together with the academics who I was working with over to Greece, and we will do it in the real cave.
That is very cool.
And funnily enough, you'll love this. One of my guys, a couple of guys that have interviewed me in the past are called the Dreaming Jaguars. And one of the guys is one of the guys responsible for the filming, a lot of the filming using drones that's used in the David Attenborough programs. Okay, and he's one of the guys that does the drone filming. And when he interviewed me, he used a drone. So I'm walking through a forest and you can see the drone comes down as I'm walking through it. Really, really good. Again, I can send you the link to this. But he and I decided we could do something extraordinary at the start of the Anthony Peake and Plato's cave. And what we plan to do, if we can get a rule for this, we're going to have a drone on the top of the Acropolis, and the drone will take off and it will fly out over Egina and the islands near in, because I'm a total Grecophile. I go to Greece twice a year. And it will fly over the islands, and it will come in over Cape Sunion, which is this beautiful Doric temple that sits on a cape. It will then zoom out into the ocean, into the sea again, and it will come in, and it will literally fly into the cave. And as it flies into the cave, I'm going to be standing there in my purple robes going, "Welcome to Plato's cave."
Wow.
And we think that's going to be a mind-blowing opening to the experiment, but that's an aside. So going back again then, so we're doing the levels. So we've got to the point of the individuated ego consciousness, which is the eidolon, one life. Then you have the daemon that lives many lives, but is literally you. It's your higher self that lives many lives, but it's still you. Then you have above that, you have what I call the Uberdaemon, which is the Jungian collective unconscious. And I believe that when people have like past life memories of being other people, when they're hypnotized, they attune into the collective unconscious. And that's why they can become a 14th century peasant in the Auvergne in France.
Sure.
Because this is what's happening. Because all of these are all you. You're reducing down from a greater consciousness. So the daemon is one greater consciousness. The Uberdaemon is another greater consciousness, which is all humanity. And then above that, I have what I call the Godemon, which is literally the source. It is the consciousness that the whole universe is created upon. And I argue, using esoteric terms, that this is the equivalent of the Kabbalistic concept of the Or Ein Sof, the idea of the singular consciousness.
Yeah.
And as Bill Hicks famously said in his monologue, that we are but one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. Right. And this is exactly what the ancient Greeks believed. It's exactly what the Vedantists believe, when we have the concept of Brahman, the idea of a singular consciousness. So consciousness is prime. So the consciousness field we attune into. And depending on how much our doors of perception is open is how wide our perceptual field works. Now, again, people will turn around and say, okay, yes, this guy's suddenly gone off onto this really weird, unscientific tangent. It's not unscientific. My associates, my new book, the guy that's written the foreword for it is a guy called Dr. Pascal Michael, who's one of the world's new leading neuroscientists. And he wrote the foreword. In fact, again, last year, I managed to get him an invite to Contact in the Desert. He went down really, really well.
Cool.
So the experiments are proving that, and it's been long suspected, but it's now scientifically proven, the brain acts as an attenuator. The brain is there to take information out in order for us to function correctly within the simulation. Mm-hmm. But under some circumstances, we can attune into the broader information field, as I mentioned before. But it's never been proven before. But around about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, an extraordinary experiment took place at the University of Sussex. I think it was a guy called Anil Seth did it. I think I'm right in saying it was Anil that did this. And what they did was they had volunteers taking psilocybin, magic mushrooms. The logic being that they would then scan their brains using fMRI scans or whatever, super duper scanning machines to find out what happens within the brain when somebody starts hallucinating. Now, the general belief was that the hallucinatory substances link parts of the brain together in such a way that we start to hallucinate and creating an alternate reality. Much to their astonishment, they discovered the opposite happens. The psilocybin switches off the brain's ability to communicate with other parts of the brain. So in other words, by taking something away from the brain is what allows us to perceive the greater reality. Right. So in which case, when Aldous Huxley argued in 1954 that the brain was an attenuator, he was right in the doors of perception, as was C.D. Broad, as was Henri Bergson. So this whole idea that consciousness, that reality is just there. It's not. There's a much broader reality that we are denied. Yeah. But certainly, if you have migraine, classic migraine, you have temporal lobe epilepsy, autism, Alzheimer's disease, all of these open up the doors of perception. Alzheimer's, for instance, it's because the microtubules in the brain are destroyed by the amyloid plaques within the brain that actually stops the brain's ability to act as an attenuator. I even go down to that kind of level of description as to why this happens. I do quite get frustrated sometimes. A lot of the world are not aware of what I'm doing. And I feel I'm this little guy beavering away with all these ideas. And I keep seeing books being written by other people. And I keep going, I've already done this. I wrote this 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's the way of the world. It's the way of the world.
Well,
Well, I appreciate it, and I feel like I'm in the unique position to understand all of these references because I've been doing this about a decade at this point. So I've talked to just hundreds and hundreds of people who are either the people or exactly adjacent to the people that are core to a lot of these concepts you're talking about. So at least you can have the pleasure of knowing that I'm loving it and I'm enjoying this multidisciplinary approach. But yeah, so that I don't know if this is the same study, but there are those images going around the internet a few years ago of fMRI of the brain on psilocybin, and it's kind of paradoxical because if it's the same study, I'm not sure if it is, but it's got all these, imagine I'll find the image and put it up
Mm.
here, but essentially in some ways it looks like the brain is hyper connected, but what's actually happening is that most of our consciousness takes place on one of a few networks. Like the most
Yeah,
famous one is like the default mode network.
yeah.
But then what you get when you ingest psilocybin or probably any other tryptamine is you get an entropy of those brain networks such that you're no longer in any of these familiar brain networks. It's this entropic lower level interconnectivity that is holistic, but like you're saying, greatly dampened
Mm.
from our normal way of perceiving things. So such that to just underscore your point that it isn't like the brain is going crazy manifesting all of these illusions. In reality, it's humming at a much lower frequency. And I don't know, I'm curious now because I've been so deep down the rabbit hole of this whole gateway paper, which is it's funny because this thing is written in 1983, but a lot of the science that's talked about in this, I mean, it's very similar to a lot of the stuff that you talk about. I mean, they talk about Bohm, they talk about Prebrum, they talk about holographic universe theory. They talk about the idea that there is this one underlying reality, which they call the absolute, and that we're all holograms of the absolute, manifested as these little individuated sort of I don't know, atoms of consciousness, but that we are able to, under the right circumstances, go all the way back to the absolute through all the intermediary states or energy systems of consciousness. And me, as someone who is a deeply, I think the philosophical lineage that I'm the closest
Mm.
to is Platonism for sure. Um, and these ideas map one to one on Platonism. Like for instance, this idea that you were talking about of consciousness being primary. This is the nous, right? The
Mm.
noetic
Yeah.
realm. And for Platonists, that is the primary reality, and this physical world that we live in is like a shadow of that reality.
The pleroma and the kenoma within Gnosticism as well.
Right, right. Yes, yes. And what's interesting too is Plotinus, the often considered to be the father of Neoplatonism, he actually and again Iamblichus talks about this too, the idea that the daimon, this kind of comports with your idea that there's like a daimonic hierarchy, right? So you and this is really interesting. I won't go all the way into this aside, but there, we have in Greek terms, ho daimon, like the daimon that presides over us and our souls and our fates collectively. But then there are all of these like little spirits and daimons within the person too that has all of these like sub jobs. And both Iamblichus and Plotinus talk about the idea that there can be a daimonic change, so that if you somehow satisfy the mission or capacity of your daimon, you actually sort of level up to having a new daimon. Um, so yeah, there is this idea. So I think you're definitely onto something.
Well, I think
You're you're in good company if you're arriving at similar conclusions to
just very, very
Plotinus. Yeah.
quickly, one of the points you made earlier on was a very, very interesting and a very good one, was the idea about the brain channels that
Mhm.
facilitate these things. And in one of my latest books, I argue that we're missing the point with the neuronal model, the neurons being the communication facilities within the brain. And I argue that we're getting this wrong. Kajal and people like that, we became preoccupied with the neurons. But of course, the neurons communicate very slowly, relatively. The kind of the synapses and the communications across the synapses using neurochemicals and neuromodulators is not very fast. Whereas we touched upon, didn't we, non-locality before?
Yeah.
And I'd like to argue that the reason we don't understand the workings of the brain when it comes to accessing greater realities is we're looking at the neuronal brain when we should be looking at the astroglial network. By this, I mean that you hear people use the phrase, we only use 1/10 of our brain, but people don't actually fully understand what they mean by that. What is meant by this is 1/10 of the cells in the brain are neurons. But the rest of the cells in the brain are called glial cells. And they're called glial from the Greek for glue, because when Kajal and people noticed it when they were doing the staining to see where the neurons were, they came to the conclusion that these things were here to just hold the neurons in place. But recent research has shown that, and of course it is, the nature doesn't waste things. It's not going to have wasting all those cells. And its work is now suggesting that the astroglial network itself, the glial cells, communicate in a completely different way. And they communicate non-locally. They use quantum physics to communicate. So they can effectively communicate virtually instantaneously across the brain, which means that one glial cell can communicate with another specific glial cell in a specific location, which means that much more information can be processed. And I argue that is demonic consciousness. Yeah. That is the consciousness that's looking outwards and upwards outside of what I would call kenoma. Well, what the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics called the kenoma, the work of the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, the world of, what the Gnostics believe of matter. Mm-hmm. And the astroglial network, I argue, and I really want to work with neurologists on this as to whether I'm right, because I'm not saying I'm not a neurologist, I'm just a very enthusiastic amateur. But if you apply the orchestrated objective reduction model of Hammerhoff and Penrose, and you then take that away from the neurons and put it inside the astroglial network, and you work on non-locality, it suggests that the brain is much more interesting and much more powerful. And this would explain there are a number of issues that neurologists have with the workings of the brain. And one is called the binding problem. And the binding problem is how we have a feeling of simultaneity. Because as I said before, the actual transmission speed of neuronal information is quite slow. But if I see a red bouncing ball going down the road, the red is being processed in different parts of the brain to where the bouncing and the background, they're all in different parts of the brain. Yet I have a feeling of seeing a red bouncing ball, which is impossible. As I always say to people, if you ever want neurologists to start getting embarrassed when they start, when they're getting hubristic, just say the binding problem and watch them suddenly change and get twitchy and they're not sure what they're talking about. And that is because they don't understand how this works. So I argue that the binding problem can be cured if the brain communicates instantaneously. Now, I also think that the other point we're missing here is even with neurotransmitters. For instance, there is strong arguments now to believe that dimethyltryptamine is not only in the body, which we know it is, but it's also been found in the brain and in the pineal gland of live rats.
Yeah.
Now, then the question has to be asked, where is it coming from? And I'd argue that what is taking place, and again, there might be neurologists out there or neurochemists out there saying I'm talking a load of nonsense, and if I am, please tell me. But my hypothesis here is that the pineal gland exists to process melatonin.
Yeah.
And if you look at the molecular structure of melatonin, I think I'm right in saying that you either take away or add 2 hydrogen atoms to the structure to change melatonin into another substance, dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah.
So in which case, it's quite simple that the pineal gland can synthesize from melatonin dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah.
Endogenous.
I would imagine you must have talked to Strassman at some point.
Strassman and I know of each other's work, and we've
Okay.
written to each other, but we've never actually spoken. But yes,
Okay.
I'm very aware of Strassman's work.
I spoke with him recently, and the question of endogenous DMT featured fairly heavily in the conversation, and for whatever reason, I had slowly worn down my general idea that DMT was really secreted by the pineal gland. But when I don't know why, I feel like there'd been certain studies, other big neurologists that came out and publicly were like, no, there's not. That this is a misnomer. This is a myth. But when I talked to Strassman, he is still pretty sure that that is the case, and he cited a lot of studies to that effect, not just personal feelings. So, and actually, before early in his career, something I did not know before he got interested in DMT, there were reasons to believe that perhaps melatonin could be psychedelic. And he looked into
Mhm.
melatonin early on in his career, determined, okay, there's nothing particularly psychedelic about melatonin. So I just wanted to throw that in there because he's definitely an expert in both melatonin and DMT. So he could probably, it might be worth reaching out to him about
And
that.
interestingly enough, he is one of the contributors, one of the sub researchers in the Gimo Borgigin paper, where
Mhm.
they discovered the melatonin, the DMT in the pineal gland of live rats. It was
Yes.
Gimo Borgigin and her team at the University of. I always remembered. I've gone and forgotten. I'm getting old, but effectively, what she discovered was quite extraordinary. And of course, interestingly enough, Borgigin's other discovery was of the brain activity around about 9 or 10 seconds after the death of a rat. Where suddenly they discovered that there's brain activity after the brain is dead. And of course, this was proved in 2022. And I think I'm the first writer that's gone to press on this particular incident in my latest book on near-death experiences. But in Munich, I think it was in Germany in 2022, there was a guy, an 87-year-old guy who fell off a ladder. I think he was American living in Germany, and he fell off a ladder and he was rushed to hospital. And he went into status epilepticus, where he went into a series of seizures and everything. And they placed him inside. They were scanning his brain, I think. Not sure what kind of scanner they were using, but they were scanning his brain. And when they were scanning his brain, he died.
Oh
So for the
man.
first time, they had they were able to measure what happens in the brain at the point of death. And much to their astonishment, but not to mine, because it is absolutely central to my own hypothesis, because I argue that this is when the brain activity really takes place, which is the near-death experience. Again, around about 6 to 7 seconds after he had died, the brain went into massive communication, where all the areas of the brain were communicating with each other. Now, this is the first time that the near-death experience, the panoramic life review, for want of a better term, the out-of-body experience, was actually being shown to be taking place within the brain, or the brain was creating the hallucination, in raised commas, of the near-death experience. And I'm using the word hallucination in the same argument that everything we perceive is a brain-generated
Right.
hallucination. So I use the term hallucination, but I'm not being derogatory there in any shape or form, nor being pejorative. I am stating a fact. Everything is an hallucination. And this is really interesting. So this suggests something. We're at the edge of some very interesting discoveries here in terms of what's happening in the brain. And I'd like to believe I'm one of the few writers that's attempting to pull this together if I can.
Definitely. Are you familiar with Donald Hoffman's work?
I am. It's excellent, superb.
Yeah.
I quote Hoffman a number of times in two of my books. I'm very
Yeah.
interested in his work. Him and I, we've got a very similar approach to it. I saw you interview Donald, didn't you? I think
Yes. Yeah.
you've
Actually,
had
I
some
think.
great guests. You have some fantastic guests on here, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. And actually, even before I was on YouTube, I think I have 3 or 4 other interviews with him too. So I've talked to him more than most podcasters, and I've really tried to throw a lot of different things his way and like take him off his usual script to see where he lands on things. And he really is a scientist first, and he's entertains a lot of different things, but he really tries to keep things to what can I say mathematically, what can I propose, what experiments can I do, and his create, like, he and a very small other handful of scientists, I think, are the ones pushing us forward in a lot of these ways that you're talking about, where they're willing to take ideas that are seemingly way beyond the standard scientific interpretation, but doing just some very creative um inversions of ideas. Because, like, for Hoffman, you know, natural selection is one of the core points of the way that he works his theory, yet he jumps to almost a completely inside out, consciousness first sort of conclusion from using evolution by natural selection. And we don't have to get into his whole argument, but it has precisely to do with what you're talking about, that
Mm,
um we do not perceive reality as it is whatsoever. And not only is that naive realism, it's 0% of reality, as he
yeah.
calls it. And he uses that example all the time of reality being like an evolutionarily convenient computer desktop that we're interacting with, that there is no reality behind. It's just the way that we have to perceive reality in order to survive, in order to reproduce, etc. So yeah, you guys seem to be on a very,
Well,
very similar
I would
wavelength.
be delighted to be put in contact with him because I've been labouring. I sometimes feel almost alone for over 2 decades on this subject matter, and because although I'm university educated and I did postgrad and everything else, I am not an academic. I literally read extensively and use my training as a sociologist to apply these ideas and try to learn as much as I possibly can about the science. But I feel sometimes I've been furrowing a very lonely route as an academic outsider, whereas I feel that there is a degree of credibility in the stuff I'm presenting because first and foremost I do the science.
Yeah.
And, if you read my books that, I reference everything I say back to science. And if in some way, in my idiotic way, I've got the wrong end of the stick, I'm more than happy for people to point this out to me. Because I notice, is it Federico Fagin? I think the author
Fagine,
interview.
yeah. Yeah.
He again is somebody I'm an admirer of. But I'm reading what they write and I'm going, God, I wrote that in 2001. you
Yeah.
know and again, I'm not upset, I'm not annoyed, in any shape or form. I'm delighted that people are now, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, but just occasionally I just feel, I did get there first. you know
Well,
um,
yeah, and in some ways, like we've been alluding to, like, I mean, Anaxagoras, the pre-Socratic philosopher, had this idea of nous, of consciousness being
mm,
primary, before Socrates was alive. But I feel like as we are, upping the resolution on the ways that we understand and interact with reality, we have to keep having an anamnesis or a
yeah,
rearrival or a
good use of words.
reassessment of these ideas to see if they still work. And many of them seem to be working better than ever before. I
Yeah,
feel like it's one of the things where we're circling around.
because
Um,
I get so excited, when I read about the ancient Greek philosophers and I read some of their work, and I think, if you look at this as a coding, they hit the nail right on the head. Like,
yeah,
for instance, the reason I call my concept cheating the ferryman is again a reference to Charon the boatman.
yeah,
And again, the idea, that you get taken, you cheat the ferryman, you don't pay his oboli as you cross the Styx. But also the idea that when you got to the other side, you had the opportunity to either drink of the waters of the Lethe,
hmm,
so that you would forget who
yeah,
you were and you'd allowed to go back to live your life again, or you would remain, or you would have anamnesis, the loss of forgetting. Um, and to me, these are all incredibly complex, interesting ideas. And I'm just delighted to be able to be speaking to somebody that you get everything I'm coming from, which is brilliant, which is really, really wonderful to have that happen.
likewise, likewise. So okay, let's zoom out into some irresponsible but very, for me, centrally interesting philosophical spiritual territory, which is the question of, so I understand your thesis that you're putting forward around consciousness, around the human being, but then I'm curious, what do you think the sort of meta mission
Ooh.
of an individual soul is? What is on the line? Is there a failure? Is there a success? Because so for there's a big difference between for instance the Platonist idea and the Gnostic idea at the end of the day, which is that well, first of all, I guess we should, from before, we should put a bullet point on the fact that for the Platonists, the demiurge is not evil. The
Mm.
demiurge is simply the consciousness that essentially like worked with um, the uh, the forms and instantiated all the sort of laws of reality, and gave human beings individual souls that were sort of mirrors of the demiurge itself, therefore giving humans the capacity to create, to have free will, all of these things, but within the construct of physical nature. And then instead of the problem of evil becoming this kind of malevolent construct, it's just sort of the natural manifestation of living in physical reality, where you have these um, mortal, uh, you know, things running around with free will that can do whatever they want, and some of those things are manifest in the world as evil. But anyway, before I go further on that note, one of the most interesting ideas to me comes from Jung's Red Book, where he mirrors this Platonic idea with the concept of the principium individuationis, or the principle of individuation, where in that picture right there in the Red Book, it's Philemon addressing the throngs of the dead, and he's sort of explaining the whole existential situation of the human, right? And he says basically, if you fail to individuate, you sort of disappear back the um into the pleroma, and you become this kind of, you just dissolve back into the
Mm.
ocean. But those who individuate become as distant stars, is what he says. And then, as I've gone deeper into Platonism, I come across this idea of the ogoetes soma, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but that's this idea of the star body. And as soon as I read that, I was like, okay, this is where Jung got this idea of
Mm.
becoming this like immortal star version of the self. So one, this is one of the questions that I always want to ask guests like you, is how you interpret this idea. And two, does this comport with your theory, or is your theory different?
No, totally. It resonates in so many ways. And in effect, I really liked your comparison between Platonism and Gnosticism. And I think one of the major problems with Gnosticism is its negativity and its idea, because of course it existed, didn't it, to explain why evil existed. And the
Yep.
idea that, the demiurge Yaldabaoth created this false universe, which in itself is inherently evil, and that we have inside ourselves a shard of the pleroma,
Hmm. Hmm.
which I've argued, is analogous with the Daemon in many, many ways. But it's a very negative. And although I was quite fascinated by the teachers of people like the Mani and the Manichaeans, I find it very, very negative and very, very bleak as a philosophy. Whereas the optimism you find in Platonism is
Yeah.
much more interesting to me. But to go back
Agreed.
to the teleological reasoning as to what is going on within Cheating the Ferryman, anyway, um, I think it is quite interesting and important to mention that the Russian language edition of my first book, the editors decided to call it Groundhog Life, and I
Mm.
thought that was quite intriguing and interesting because they had twigged the central premise of what I was trying to say in a very, very effective way. And I guess this is because probably a good deal of Russians will have read Peter Ouspensky and Ouspensky's ideas in terms of coming back and living your life again and the eternal recurrence and the eternal return, which is central to my Cheating the Ferryman hypothesis. It is not Nietzschean in any way at all. It's like Nietzsche, but not. It's more like Ouspensky in the sense that you don't live the same life over and over again. But the analogy here with the movie Groundhog Day is quite important, And indeed, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to interview on my podcast Danny Rubin, who was the original writer of the Groundhog Day script.
Oh, cool.
Although I can't remember the guy that was in Ghostbusters, that was the guy that was considered to be acknowledged to be the man behind it. It was very much Danny's script and Danny's idea. And Danny, when my first book came out, Danny told me that he gave copies of my first book to all his friends at Harvard because he said, this guy's done the science of Groundhog Day, which I thought was a lovely thing. By the way, he's such a funny guy. All the great funny lines in Groundhog Day were him. And when you interview him, you understand the humor. He's very, very, very funny. But that's rather an aside. Now, if you remember in the movie, the guy Connors goes to Punxsutawney to see Punxsutawney. Is it Punxsutawney Phil? It's not Phil, is it? Punxsutawney.
Now that you've said it, it sounds right to me, but I'm not
but it's
sure.
not. But I know it's not because somebody corrected me recently and said no, it wasn't Punxsutawney Phil, but it's Punxsutawney something anyway, which is a little groundhog that pops out on a particular day in February, and if he pops his head back in again, the winter's going to be worse or something. And what happens is he does the day and he does the filming, chats up one of his associates, fails, goes to bed, and he wakes up the next morning and Sonny and Cher, I've got you babes on the radio, and it was the previous morning, which he thinks it's because the radio station have got it wrong. And he goes downstairs and he discovers that everything that had happened the previous day is happening again to him. Now, this again is the idea of the eternal return or the eternal recurrence, but it's not. In other words, the eternal return and the eternal recurrence is effectively that you live the same life over and over again, and therefore Connors would live the same day over and over again. But the reason that it is different for Connors to everybody else in the scenario is that Connors remembers what happened the day before.
Yeah.
So he amends his behavior depending upon the knowledge he has. And what I would argue in the movie, Connors is effectively what I call a dyad. And a dyad is when a daemon and an eidolon share the same consciousness. So in other words, the daemon remembers what you did in your last life or your last day or whatever, and your eidolon does not. But Connors is both. So he amends his behavior, which means he amends what other people do and can influence other people's lives. And of course, initially he wants to bed the girl, and he finds the best way to bed the girl is to take her out a few times because he realizes he's living the same day over and over again. No, he doesn't, does he? First, he tries to commit suicide and fails and does all kinds of weird things like driving on railway tracks and everything, committing suicide. And he still fails because he still keeps coming back. So he realizes he can use the knowledge he gains from the previous day when he dated her, took her out for a meal and asked her what her favorite movie was or her favorite novel. And she turns around and tells him. So the next day he goes, do you know my favorite novel is Dostoevsky or whatever? And she goes, wow, I love Dostoevsky as well. So over a period of time, he uses that to try for personal gain. He's doing it for completely selfish reasons. But then he wants to impress us, so he learns how to play the piano, learns how to sing, and he reads all the books he can read. And suddenly he starts to change, and knowledge starts to change him. After many iterations, he realizes that it's not being selfish, it's altruism that's important. And he realizes he can use that knowledge to run round the town, catch the little boy falling out of the tree, and also try and save the tramp, which he fails to do. But effectively, he's learning, he's developing over each life he learns. And I argue that what takes place is over those myriad of lives, and Danny told me he calculated that probably Connors would have had 5,000 or 6,000 days, and he starts to become a better human being. He starts to become effectively a bodhisattva. He becomes a Buddha. He uses his power to do good. And at that point, whatever is the thing that has caused the time warp allows him to move on to the next day. And I genuinely believe this is what life is. I believe that we live in a virtual reality, for want of a better analogy, version of our lives, where every outcome is already programmed in there. And us, with the guidance of our daemon, live that life a myriad of times. And each time we either get better or we get worse. But what we're doing is we're striving to become a bodhisattva. We're striving to become a complete human being. Now, I also argue that all daemons aren't necessarily good. Daemons are motivated in exactly the same way. For instance, I use the analogy, you may recall, I think I mentioned it in the Daemon, the book, that the daemon that Hitler's daemon allowed him to kick the bomb behind the Staunchen during the Stauffenberg plot. So effectively, his daemon saved Hitler's life.
Sure.
Which allowed Hitler to continue with his atrocities for a year or two. So, but the daemon's interest is literally the survival of its eidolon within the game. Now, this means that at the end of all these myriad of lives, which are experienced in hypertime, in orthogonal time, all in the final milliseconds of your life, you live infinite number of lives, all different. And by the way, I also argue that your life is not just laid out on what you've lived this life now, because of course where you're located now was dependent upon your parents. Your parents could have chosen to live somewhere else, and that's encoded in your grandparents, your great grandparents. So all these things mean that effectively anything that can happen will happen. And this is exactly what quantum mechanics says. You know, if you look at the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics and the more subtle versions that are now bandying around, I mean, the work of people like the Swedish guy that did the Max Tegmark, for instance, you know, and Tegmark's work, you know, you can see that quantum physics is moving this way. And of course, there was a very famous book in the UK written by a very popular scientist in the UK called Brian Cox, with a guy called Jeff Forshaw. And the subtitle of that book was Everything That Can Happen Will Happen. I did an event with Jeff Forshaw a few years ago at the National Theatre in London. Really, really nice guy. In fact, I met him at the University of Manchester, where he's professor of quantum mechanics there. And over coffee, he just dropped into the conversation. He said to me, of course, we now know that every electron in the universe knows the location of every other electron. You know, that's one of the top scientists in the world. This is how different the world is from science, from what the average man in the street thinks is really happening. So I argue that after many, many lives, we then move on. Now, when we become that kind of advanced human being, we have a choice, I think. And what we then do is we then move into dissipate into the uber daemon state, where we become part of the collective consciousness of mankind. Or we move further up into being to the Godemon, where we just become the greater consciousness. Mm-hmm. Or we choose to individuate again. But we could individuate in a different way. And a few years ago, I wrote a book on a fairly obscure, for the United States, but for the UK, quite well-known playwright novelist called J.B. Priestley. And Priestley wrote a fascinating play in 1937 called I Have Been Here Before, which was directly influenced by the writings of Peter Ouspensky. And in it, he has a character who's lived his life many times, who goes back into the simulation to help a young couple not make a terrible error that they made. And again, that is interesting, the idea of that. And of course, interestingly enough, Priestley was also influenced in terms of his concepts of time by a guy called J.W. Dunn, whose work you may have come across.
I don't think so.
He wrote an experiment with time in 1927, 28. Dunn was a fascinating man. He had a series of amazing precognitions, precognitive dreams in 1904, I think, when he was down in South Africa after the Boer War. And it was really weird. He had this dream, and in the dream, he's living on a French-speaking Caribbean island. And the people come to him in the town, outside the town, and they say, there's been a terrible explosion. The volcano in the town has exploded, and 4,000 people have been killed. Can you help us? And he wakes up and he thinks, God, that was such a weird dream, so vivid. And then 3 days later, the newspapers come down from London. And on that night, on the island of Martinique in the French West Indies, Mount Pelly, which was the dormant volcano, exploded. And it killed everybody in the main town of Saint-Pierre, even people in boats around the bay. In fact, the only one person who survived was a guy that was on death row who was below ground level. And when the Nuit Ardente cloud, the poisonous cloud, rolled down, it went over his head, so he survived, which is quite an irony.
Wow.
But the interesting story here is that he thought, wow, he was precognitive. And he said, but how did I know about that? How was my dream created? He discovered why a few years later when he was talking about it to somebody else. And he'd mentioned it many times in his writings. And somebody turned around and said, do you know you were wrong about the figures? And he said, what do you mean? He said, you said that 4,000 people had been killed, didn't you? And he said, yes. And he said, it wasn't 4,000, it was 40,000. So he went back to the newspaper report in the Daily Telegraph, and he realized he'd misread it. And he suddenly made the incredible conclusion that our dreams are created. Our dreams are not precognitive. They are, but not how we think they are. In other words, he was creating a dream based upon seeing the newspaper headline rather than the event itself. And he suddenly thought, this means that we can have an ability to see our immediate future. So he decided to keep notes of his dreams, and he had a notebook, and he wrote this book, Experiment with Time, and people were fascinated by this. And in fact, J.B. Priestley wrote a play called Time in the Conways about this very concept. And it's a concept I've applied in my book, The Labyrinth of Time, and in my other books as well, because I think it's such a powerful idea that we monitor the immediate future. And experiments have proven this. Again, a guy called Dean Radin and Dick Bierman did a series of experiments in 1999. Do you know with the skin conductance?
I know Dean. I don't know that particular one.
Okay, what they did was your skin conductance, the electricity in your skin, or something happens in your skin when you're frightened, when you're scared of something. And what they decided to do was to actually measure the skin conductance of people and then show them a series of photographs on a screen. And you'd have kittens and snow scenes and everything else. And then suddenly you get an awful picture of a car crash or something horrific. And they were fascinated to note that in the vast majority of cases, the skin conductance increased immediately before the awful photograph took place. And they concluded that the only conclusion from this can be that we can monitor our immediate future. And in this, when they wrote the report, it was quite fascinating because they said, and it's rather similar to the movie Minority Report that has recently come out with Tom Cruise. And Minority Report was based upon a short story by Philip K. Dick, who I wrote the book on as well. But there's a counter argument to this, and we have to be careful because there is a counter argument called the gambler's fallacy. Mm-hmm. And the gambler's fallacy is that, if you're playing red or black on a roulette wheel, every time the ball, if you're betting on black and every time the ball comes red, you calculate that the next time it's going to have to be red because it's been black for so many times. So you anticipate. So the longer you don't, what the argument is the more times that you see nice pictures, the more you're anticipating a bad one. So that's what was taking place. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's one of the arguments that we used against it. And we have to balance arguments. We can't just take things at face value.
Absolutely. Yeah. Returning to this meta question about the condition of the human, what the human is trying to do, what its ultimate fate is. I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to get to any specific theory in particular. I feel like there are features of all the different ways that people in these lineages that you and I are both interested in, the Platonic, the Gnostic, the mystical. I try to really focus on what people seem to agree on. And, there's various ideas from various Platonists, even like you don't even have to go outside of the Platonic tradition to find tremendous disagreement on can a soul, for instance, I believe it is, which Platonist is it? One of them specifically talks about that you can graduate from being a human soul to being a daimon yourself. And then, very similar to what you're talking about, Iamblichus is of the opinion nope, a human soul is a human soul is a human soul. And interestingly, the best thing for him is to become like a Platonic bodhisattva so that you become more and more aware of what you are in a way that transcends lifetimes. And then, similarly to the allegory of the cave, now that you've gotten out of the cave and that you are directly connected to the nous, you can go back down into the cave and help other people. But that's the limit of a human soul. For Iamblichus, or sorry, for Plotinus, you already have an undescended self akin to sort of Jung's immortal star body, and it's just that a part of you or a piece of that soul or awareness has become enamored with itself in such a way that it has projected itself down into the physical world and forgotten about what it really is that it's coexisting as already. And then the mission of the philosopher sage is to, in this lifetime, reascend back to Henosis and remember, oh, I am actually this undescended thing that is one and immortal and whatever, and that's my true state. So even within all these traditions, you get so many different ideas or emphases that are placed differently, but they all do seem to agree that you reincarnate, and they all do seem to agree that the soul can become more or less aware of its true nature. And that's one of those ideas that seems to be completely unshakable through almost all of these traditions. No matter what they disagree on, that seems to be something that they agree on.
I totally agree. And it's one of the things that I find extraordinary is that over the nearly 30 years now that I've been involved in this research, this life, well, 50, 60 years if you take it to its logical conclusion, but there is nothing I've come across that doesn't reinforce my hypothesis. And there's no discoveries I've come across that doesn't reinforce my uber hypothesis about the nature of reality. And then I jump to the conclusion. I say, well, this is interesting. It's almost a vindication of my egregore theory. Because if in some way I'm co-creating the external reality around me by my anticipations, it is not at all surprising that the world around me and the things I read and the things I write and discover reinforce my own particular beliefs, because if everything is an extension of my ego in some way, that would be exactly how it would happen. And that then begs certain questions, because it means, as was it Pierce, the American philosopher, who came up with the concept of the phaneron, the idea that we all exist within our own internally created version of reality.
Like an Umwelt.
Like the Umwelt, exactly
Yeah.
like the Umwelt, and again, Philip K. Dick was fascinated by the concept of the Umwelt. If you read his exegesis, have you read the exegesis?
I'm somewhat familiar with it. I spoke with I cannot think of his name, professor from Pennsylvania who's written about his exegesis, and I can't think of his name now, but I haven't read it personally.
Okay, because it's a hard read. You can't read it because it's just notes. But if you dip in and out of it, the things we've been discussing absolutely preoccupied Phil unbelievably. He was fascinated by the Greek philosophers. He was fascinated by the concept of Sophia. He wrote into his books, and one of his stories he has, it's called The Divine Invasion. And it actually has a character in that called Mani. And Mani is God who has forgotten he's God. And of course, this is one of the major concepts that I argue as well, is that effectively we are all embodiment of the Daemon, and the Daemon has placed itself within its own soap opera. It's living there all eternally. So what's it going to do? Well, it's going to create its own environment, its own storylines, and then go into the storylines and see them from the first person perspective and exist in them. And of course, that's what Phil argues, that Mani is suffering from amnesis, and we're all suffering from amnesis, and we need to acquire anamnesis, which is the loss of forgetting. And by forgetting, realizing who we really are is when we can expand and move forward. And it's beautiful. I mean, it makes so much rational sense to me. It gets around, doesn't it, the state of anomie, the state of chaos. And it's the only other alternative. Either the universe is just cold, indifferent nothing, and we are just, as I said in one of my books, if you just take the cold materialist viewpoint, all it means is, for far as you're concerned, is for billions of years, there was nothing. Then something became sentient for an incredibly tiny, small amount of time, and then disappeared again. And I saw something recently, which I thought was very intriguing, was the idea of how the universe is going to end. And they argue that when all the stars burn out and all the energy disappears, that will be 1,000th of the lifetime of the universe. So the universe will exist for 999 times more longer than it had done as nothing, just dead. And you think, what the hell is the point of that? But of course, that is being human. That is trying to define things by what I think. And of course, that's incredibly egoistic and naive. The universe may not care. But I'd like to believe that if consciousness is prime, there is a purpose. There is a teleological reason as to why we are.
Yeah. Yeah. That's certainly the Platonic viewpoint. But I think there's a lot of contemporary thinkers who believe that as well, at least in some sense. Did you must have read Itzhak Bentov's work at some point?
Oh, I love him. He was hugely influential. Stalking the Wild Pendulum.
Yes.
Influenced me unbelievably. Fantastic book. He died tragically, didn't he? He was killed in a terrorist attack. Yeah.
Yes. So I don't know. Have you read the declassified gateway paper?
No.
Okay. So this is the formerly classified paper written by this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonnell, and he was the vessel, basically, that the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, basically like the Army's intelligence wing, he was the one that they had go study with Robert Monroe, go through the whole gateway process, and write a whole multidisciplinary treatise on the practical, philosophical, and scientific sort of argument for how and why this works. And he draws very largely on Bentov and Stalking the Wild Pendulum, but he also brings up Pribram. He brings up a number of the same scientists that you reference. So it's kind of a funny synchronicity listening to your Daemon book, because you keep bringing up every scientist that I'm like, oh, well, this is exactly talked about in the Gateway paper as well. But the reason I bring that up is because Bentov's idea is that the universe itself is in this sort of cyclical process where it oscillates between being birthed from a white hole and dying in a black hole and then reemerging outside of another white hole. And I have no idea if any contemporary astrophysicists would agree with this idea, but I know Penrose believes that the universe goes in like waves of big bangs, and it's not just one big bang, but it's some kind of also recurrence. So yeah, I don't think that you're alone in this idea that there's this maybe I'm just reaching with this implication, but I don't think we're the only ones who are in this state of forever coming and going. It seems like the universe itself is probably a macro version of our micro universe.
As I've long argued, the major issue that people miss when they start discussing about cyclical time and they discuss the mystery of the universe and everything else is time itself. In my book, The Labyrinth of Time, I'm very much of the same opinion as St. Augustine, and he said that if I think about time, if I don't think about time, I can understand it completely. But the moment I start to reflect on time, I suddenly realize I don't understand it at all. And then, of course, if you go into cosmology and you go into Einsteinian physics, we know that time and space are the same thing. Suddenly what is that really means in genuine terms is the receptacle that contains everything that there is also the time flow within that receptacle. So suddenly you've got this kind of really weird, brain hurting idea.
Yeah.
But time itself is not what we think it is at all. Time is, as somebody once jokingly said, it's to make sure that everything doesn't happen all at the same time. But the reality is that it is very, very strange. And of course, we have our own subjective time experiences.
Yeah.
Time can dilate. Time can do lots of things. So what really are we talking about here? You know, people turn around and say, well, time is just the second law of thermodynamics. It's just entropy. But that's not explaining it. It's explaining an effect of time. It's not explaining what time is. You know, it's like the idea, you know, people say, well, you can measure time on a clock. Well, the clock isn't measuring time. Clock is measuring distance as it moves round. It's not measuring time. And it's the only thing I know that's measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples, but you can only ever have a minute of a minute. And is my minute the same as your minute? And this is where J.W. Dunn came up with a wonderful analogy, because he argued, the guy that wrote Experiment with Time,
Mm-hmm.
he came up with he was an engineer, so he thought very practically. And he said, let's think about this for a second. If time flows, what's it flowing against? He said, for instance, if I look at a river and I see a river flowing, I know the river is flowing because I see the riverbanks, and I can gauge the movement of the river by the riverbanks. But time is different. There isn't a kind of a gauge that the flow of time is measured against. So when we say time flows, it's not. It could be static. So what he then came to the conclusion, quite cleverly, is that there's another form of time, which he called time 2. And he said, the river of time in time 1 is measured against time 2. And time 2 is measured against time 3. And in each of these times, there is a consciousness, awareness. So what I'd call the eidolon lives in this time flow, but our daemon lives in time 2.
Yeah.
And then there's another, and of course there's an infinite regress here and everything else. But nevertheless, he then argues that this means how precognition can work is that the person, observer 2, is like a man, observer 1, the eidolon, is like somebody in a train carriage looking out of a window straight away as the train is leaving a station. And as the station disappears, that goes into the past, and where the train is going is the future. But the daemon, or what he called observer 2, is like somebody sitting on the roof of the train. Mm-hmm. And he can therefore see the station still within his specious moment, as it's known. You know, the idea of what is the moment, what is the constitute of time, which I can't remember which philosopher came up with the specious present. I should know.
I don't know either.
But the idea is, isn't it, you know, when you start to think, well, what is the moment? And when a moment, as soon as you focus in on a moment, it's gone. And as I said in one of my books, think about existence. The future hasn't occurred, and the past has gone. So therefore, we exist in a nexus point between two nothings, don't we? And we just move along something. I'm having a meeting in the next few weeks with a British mathematician called Julian Barber. And Julian Barber in the late 1990s wrote an amazing book called The End of Time. And it's very Platonic. He actually calls the world we live in Platonia. And he applies Minkowski's block time to the idea of time. And he argues it's a series of images. We exist in a series of still images like a cartoon. And all we do is our perception is what causes the illusion of movement and what causes the illusion of time passing. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah. Do you think time 2 maps onto the idea of Chyros?
Tell me what that is. I don't know. It's a term. I know the term, but I don't know what it means.
So the Greeks had 2 concepts of time, essentially. Chronos, chronological time as we think about it, cause and effect, etc. And then there was Chyros, which is it's more like a subjective time or the right time for something to happen. So it's I mean, the easiest way, I have no idea what your thoughts on astrology are, but the easiest example would be like, an alignment of planets creates a certain Kairos. Or this is very central to Jung because it's like the idea of, like, let's just say there's an archetypal energy active in the zeitgeist, right? Like we see certain, like you and I could make certain chirotic proclamations about the state of the world based on like political demagoguery and the rising of nationalism and conservatism, and all of that would be emblematic of a certain kind of Chyros or a certain kind of archetypal
Right.
time.
Okay.
And that sort of in a way creates a context, right? That sort of creates a riverbank for time to flow against. And I don't know if that's exactly the best way to put it, because it's more like it imbues time with a quality more than it contextualizes its flow chronologically. But I do think that it's one of those missing ideas that one has to account for, in the same way that one has to account for subjective experience and consciousness. We also have to account for what are these odd collective roilings of energy that seem to be happening. And of course, Jung again would say like these are like archetypes constellating from the collective unconscious, but there is also activity occurring in the collective unconscious past the horizon of the individual human's perception. But then those things will constellate or manifest in reality in concrete ways. Um, I mean, like for instance, you use the example of Hitler before. Like he was like a huge conduit for some kind of archetypal, in Jung's terminology, like wotan energy.
Yeah.
But that's just one example.
That is very interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a concept. I know the term Chyros, but I'd never investigated what it means. So that does work very, very well as the monitor or the gauge by which time moves. So thank you for that. That's good. I like that.
For sure. Yeah, yeah. You brought before we wrap up, you brought up egregores again. And why don't we have the snake eat its own tail here
The Ouroboros.
and end where we began. One avenue of the UAP UFO phenomenon we haven't explored is like, okay, so what about the apparent physical nuts and bolts dimension of that phenomenon?
This is something that I've wrestled with for so long because I'm very much an advocate of Jacques Vallée and John Keel. You know, the idea of the cosmic joker, the great game, the fooling with us. You know, that
Hermes, Hermes.
Yeah, the idea of the poor guy that ended up with the celestial pancake, this kind of thing. It seems that there's a big joke.
I love that story. I love that story.
It's great. And do you know what I remember as well when I was reading it all those years ago was what I'd forgotten was that I think his dog came with him when he went on the trip, and the aliens didn't like the smell of the dog, so they stuck the dog on the outside of the spaceship. They just left the dog outside on the lead. And I thought, poor dog, those cosmic rays would certainly have frizzed that little animal. But
for people that don't know, there's a famous story about, and this is when the airship UFO phenomenon was in full swing, right? Where this guy saw an airship UFO, and then beings came off, or did they bring him on? Either way, he wound up with some pancakes from them.
And his proof was he had these pancakes. But he clearly wasn't making it up. And the same goes for all the people I meet at Contact in the Desert. I spend hours talking to people at Contact in the Desert. I'm not one of the talent, as they call us, that just goes into his room and stays there. I mingle and I talk to people all the time because that's my nature. And, some of the feedback I was getting from people who'd had the most extraordinary experiences, which they genuinely believed had happened to them. But there was physical evidence of the objects. We can't just, Mantell was chasing something when he was blown out the sky. So clearly there is physicality to it. But if we use the argument that they are egregores, there's no reason why an egregore can't have physical presence, because as we've discussed, what is a physical presence? What do we mean by physical? What do we mean by material? So therefore, it can be explained, or it can be magicked away maybe with the problem. So I think the antagonism that is general between the mystical argument of Keel and the Europeans and the physical nuts and bolts argument of the American school, I think they can be explained by looking at the phenomenon in a greater, broader variety. And I'll give an example here of how I feel that the phenomenon is more than we think it is from personal experience. Around about 15 years ago, my mother phoned me up, and she said something strange happened today. And she said she was in her late 80s at the time, and she was walking onto the village I was brought up in near Liverpool. And she said that my aunt had stopped to tie her shoelace, and my mother looked over my aunt, and she saw hovering over the local area what she considered was to be a smoke ball. And she said it was moving around, and it was like smoke, and then it went into a solid object, and suddenly it shot off towards North Wales at massive speed. Now, this is why I know it was a physical object, because when I told this story to a group of friends of mine, one of them contacted me and she said, I saw that object. I was on a bus on the A41 road and I saw it fly over the bus, and everybody on the bus saw it and went, what the hell was that? So my mother saw something in three-dimensional space that other people saw. So she tells me about this and said, what did I see? And I said, well, I really don't know. Don't worry about it. Anyway, she phones me up about a week later in a state of hysteria one morning. And I said, Mum, calm down. What's happened? And she said, well, you know, I live alone. And I said, yes. And she said, I always close my bedroom door. And she said, I woke up in the middle of the night and I couldn't move. She was in a state of sleep paralysis. And we all know about sleep paralysis and the thing on your chest and everything, and what causes it and what causes it physiologically and neurologically. But she said she was looking at the door and the door was open. And she thought, why is the door open? And then she described, and what she said to me still sends shivers down my spine. She said she saw 3 spindly fingers come round the door and this little creature pop its head round, blink at her and dodge back. Wow. Her description of it was, it had huge black almond eyes. It had 2 holes for a nose and a slit for a mouth. But it blinked, and it said its face came to a point. She saw a grey. Now, my mother wouldn't know a grey if it bit her on the bottom. It's not something she was ever interested in. Now, what then happened? So I think, was there a link between her seeing the UFO and that? But then things got very strange, because I go around to see her a few weeks later, and she said, the children have stopped singing to me. And I said, what children? And she said, the children that follow me round. There's little children when I'm shopping. Well, they're not children. They're kind of little spindly creatures. And they look up at me and they sing. Well, they have this high-pitched noise with them. And she said, the high-pitched noise has stopped, but the children are still here. And then she said, and she goes, but they're not as friendly as the old man in the kitchen. And I said, what old man? And she said, oh, there's an old man in the kitchen, and he nods at me, but he never speaks. Now, I knew enough about neurology that I realized, because my mother lost an eye with malignant melanoma when she was younger, and she was partially sighted. So I knew what she was developing. It's called Charles Bonnet syndrome. And it's known when your eyesight starts to fade, the brain starts to confabulate imagery to populate your visual field. It's a known phenomenon. Okay. But it's also a precursor for Alzheimer's. So I had my mother tested for Alzheimer's and discovered, yes, that she had Alzheimer's. And eventually she died of Alzheimer's. She died of the amyloid plaques in her brain, destroyed her brain. But the point I'm making here, and this is quite important, is going back to what we were talking about neurologically. And again, if there's any neurologists out there that want to talk to me about this, I'm keen to know. I think what was taking place here was that the amyloid plaques, which are the things in the brain that causes Alzheimer's disease, they destroy the microtubules. They make the microtubules explode from the inside. Now, if the brain is acting as an attenuator, that is something that stops the greater world, the greater information field coming through, the destruction of the microtubules would actually stop the brain's ability to act as an attenuator. So although my mother was losing her sight, she was attuning into a greater visual field. And that greater visual field included the entities, which were the little children, the old man, and also the UFO she saw, even though that was in 3-dimensional space. So to me, there is a neurological factor here. And I tried to get this across at Contact in the Desert last year. I'm not sure whether people grasped exactly the point I was making, because it's quite subtle. You get it because you're embedded in the philosophy and you're embedded in the research. So I think you will appreciate the point I'm trying to make here. So the Hammerhoff and Penrose argument of OR can be linked directly, in my mind, to Charles Bonnet syndrome and to also UFO sightings.
Mm-hmm.
They're all part of the same thing. It's a breakdown in the fabric of reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and we should say for people that don't know the OR, the gist of it is that Hameroff and then eventually Penrose, the famous physicist, developed this theory of consciousness that surmises that there are, so we know that there are these things in the brain called microtubules, and that they play this quantum role in the brain, such that the brain is not just this classical physics organ with electricity shooting around between neurons and brain networks, but that there is this quantum element to consciousness. And fill in the like what are the other important features of their theory?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So what they're arguing is, if you actually look at a microtubule, it has two sides to it. And they argue, if I'm right, is that single pulse photons fire from either side, biophotons. Now, I've argued, and I'm not sure whether Stuart, I talked to Stuart about this. I did an event or I met Stuart. I don't think he got the point I was trying to make. I don't think he was properly listening to me, as people don't sometimes, because, you're a nobody. They don't want to know who the hell you are. They're dealing with so many other people. But I argue that if you look at the structure of a microtubule and the photons, the biophotons, that is internally generated photonic light, electromagnetic energy, is being fired inside between the two. Now, if you take two beams of light and you put them together, you get an interference pattern, don't you?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is exactly how holograms work.
Right.
Now, if each microtubule is creating little holograms, and we have trillions of microtubules in our brain, is this what's creating and processing the simulation that we're living within? Is it? We know it's holographic in nature. I mean, a lot of the work that talking about the holographic universe theory is very, very powerful. And it's very much, and it's based upon black holes. It's based upon information theory. And again, if anybody's interested in how powerful this argument that reality is mathematical and digital in structure, read Max Tegmark's book, Our Mathematical Universe. It's extraordinary. And he's one of the world's leading cosmologists. This is not a guy down the pub. It's not some new age wacko. This guy is brilliant in the work he's doing. So the idea is, and I know, the other writers are interested in this idea, that the information is being fired inwards from the edge of the universe. Mm-hmm. And we exist. We live in a two-dimensional hologram that we believe is three-dimensional. And again, there was a fascinating series of articles in Scientific American around about 25 years ago. And the front of Scientific American was, is our universe a hologram? So this is serious stuff. This is not nonsense. It's just that the vast majority of people are not aware of this information. And I would suggest that the powers that be are probably rather worried about this information really being understood by the man in the street, because if they did, it would question everything. So they'd rather keep going on about the science of 122 years ago, 124 years ago, before Max Planck did his famous statement in December 1900 in Berlin, when he was trying to explain why it was the black body radiation didn't do what he was supposed to do. And he decided it was quantized, and energy was quantized. And everything changed. But the man in the street and most people you talk to still think that that's the science. And it's not.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I would love to know how Penrose's Platonism fits into this too, because I'm sure you've heard him talk about that there must, the Shadows of the Mind, one of his books, and I think he might talk about it in the previous book as well. But he talks about how the Platonic realm of forms is a logical inevitability, and he even goes beyond Tegmark in that he's not just like a mathematical realist. Like he doesn't just think the realm of forms is the realm of what gives math its ontological weight. He thinks there's more going. He seems to think there's more going on than the math. And I mean, he kind of tempers that but it absolutely must play a role in his understanding and interest in consciousness. You know,
Oh,
if
yeah.
if he's going as far as to be involved in Hameroff's theory, he must have some deep interest in the interplay between those concepts. But I don't know how he makes sense of it or what the limits of his Platonism are. But yeah, the fact that he openly uses that in his sort of triune. Have you seen his triangular model of
Yes,
reality?
I have.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
You know, and
I'm curious about that.
I mean, he is such an incredible writer. He's so interesting in so many ways. And you know, Stewart is interesting in himself because, of course, as an anesthesiologist, he's wanting to know where does
Yeah.
consciousness go when we take anesthetics. You know, why does that happen? We, as he argues, we know why. We know that anesthetics work, but we don't know why and how consciousness is literally switched off. And of course, this is where he's arguing. This is because consciousness at its basic level is quantum, as is. I mean, there's an associate. Well, I say he's an associate. I've met him twice. Called John Joe McFadden, Professor John Joe McFadden, who's writing about the quantum mechanics of biology. And some of the things they are discovering now, photosynthesis works on non-local principles. You know, we think we're at the end of scientific history, whereas in fact we're at the start. You know, we do not know. We're at the edge of another paradigm change. You know, the Thomas Kuhn argument. We're at another paradigm change, and all the seeds are here for a paradigm change because I call it Heath Robinson science. You know, for example, that if you use the maths they use for Einsteinian physics, the very, very large, and you plug the same formulae into quantum mechanics, they get infinities. So we have two aspects of the same reality, both of which mathematically don't match. So there has to be, as Einstein says, there has to be hidden variables. There has to be something at a deeper level, which is, of course, what David Bohm would argue. You know, the idea with his implicate and explicate orders, and the idea that this universe is a projection of a lower reality that we perceive.
Yeah. Great note to wrap this up on, my friend. Leaving it with the open mystery of, I mean, I completely agree. It seems like we're looking over the precipice of one understanding reality into these emerging new understandings and trying to connect those dots and make sense of it all. And you're right on the tip of it too, my
We
friend.
are
So
we
thank
are we are
yeah.
we are in peak in Darien experiences.
Mm. All right. Well, let's wrap this one. I'm sure we
Okay.
can do many, many more. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely, it's been great. I've really enjoyed it.